Virginia colonists used oysters as an easy food source, and they were considered a great delicacy in England. The Colonial Williamsburg Foundation has recognized the importance of the oyster in Virginia. The foundation's archaeology department has begun gathering information about their use in the 18th century.
We are engaged, we're in about year 5 of a large-scale oyster analysis. We've looked at over 15,000 oysters so far. And what we're trying to look at is how oysters were being used in the 18th century, what people were using them for, and then what other information we can get from them. So oysters are a really great repository for information about climate, information about where they were harvested from, and that stuff is really interesting to us because that tells us about the market economy, that tells us about the climate at the time, that tells us about how people were getting their food, where they were getting their food from.
Some of the data gathered from the old oyster shells includes the time of year they were harvested and the salinity of the water. Stephen Atkins tells us that the age of the oysters at the time of harvest can be determined by examining the oyster shell hinge.
So we will take a number of samples that we want to do, and we'll start our process. And this begins by cutting the hinge in half and then taking the hinge and the half that we have, and then we mount that to a slide, which is here, and then we put it on a slow speed saw in order to cut our sections. And then we can take pictures of it, or we can look, and as if you're looking here, you can see a dark line, a light line, dark light, dark light. Each one of those represents growth of the oyster shell. So this is what we call the umbo, the start of the shell, and then this area over here represents when it was harvested.
Atkins says their analysis finds that oysters were eaten and the shells discarded by Native Americans before the colonists arrived. It also fleshes out how often oysters were on the menu in the middle 1700s in places like Williamsburg.
Oysters were so popular that in England in the 14th, the 15th, the 16th century, they almost decimate their own oyster population. So they come here already loving oysters. We know oyster shells are one of the most recovered artifacts from archaeological sites in this region. So people are eating a lot of them. If you look at cookbooks, they're being used in a lot of recipes as sauces, as garnishes, as stuffings. The shells are being used for mortar production, plaster. They're being used to make pathways. We have recipes from the Virginia Gazette talking about using ground up oyster shell to cure rabies, which probably didn't work that well, but so there's a lot of different applications for them in the 18th century. They're tremendously popular.
The oysters harvested in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries came from wild oyster beds, but too much of a good thing can be a problem. Virginia's oyster industry took a nosedive in the 20th century thanks to overharvesting and disease problems. New oyster varieties and modern aquaculture operations, along with improvements in water quality, have helped bring back the Virginia oyster.
If you start overharvesting the oysters, which they did in the past, then you start having a steep decline. Then you do not have the oysters within your environment to create a clean Chesapeake Bay, because they're plankton feeders and they bring in water, dirty water, and put out clean water.
Virginia watermen harvested 650,000 bushels of oysters in 2014. Virginia's farm-raised oyster harvest contributed more than half of that, at 375,000 bushels. The good news is that oysters are back as an important part of Virginia's food industry, just like they were centuries ago. In Colonial Williamsburg, this is Dave Miller.